So let me just dive into the questions. What I'm going to do is take about 15, 20 minutes to ask questions, and then we're going to open it to the audience, okay? So what I thought each of you did a really good job of setting up the partnership, the why and the what, but I want to get into some of the lessons learned and you know, practical lessons learned that the funders and media can have about this partnership. So I want to start with you, Jim, and Jim and Jean, and throw that question to you.
You want to go first?
Please.
Okay. So I think on the good side about what's worked between our relationship is there is a close relationship, and it's one of transparency and candor. I think Jim and I are able to have conversations directly and frankly in a way that has, you know, is a benefit to me as a grantee, and I think to him as a grantor. And I think the reason that that's so important, and this goes a little bit to something that Kathy mentioned, is because, you know, yesterday, Dana Boyd talked a lot about power. And we as journalists have an incredible amount of power, being, you know, the arbiters of truth, of what is newsworthy, of what, you know, is worth the public's attention. But on the other hand, when we're sitting in these chairs, there is a lack of power. There is an imbalance of power between us and those who hold the financial capital. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that. And to figure out ways to mitigate that imbalance of power and make it a more equitable relationship. One of those ways is transparency, candor, us being able to have those conversations. Another, and this goes to what Kathy was saying, is realizing that, yes, there are some people who have kind of the social capital to be able to reach out and say, hey, you're starting a journalism fund, can I get in on that? And there are others who are never going to do that. And so going that extra mile to reach out and to figure out who's not sort of in these rooms and conversations is incredibly important. So yeah, I just wanted to put that point out there about power.
I've drawn kind of 3 lessons from the success of what we've done and what I hope will be a long-term funder-fundee relationship and a real partnership. The first, as you can see, the value of leadership. Philadelphia is really, or has been historically, a very sharp-elbowed media market, a very sharp-elbowed place in general in some ways, and like your description of Detroit, John. Somehow all of these disparate media came together behind Jean's leadership, and now her co-leader, Cassie Haynes, with whom she shares that responsibility. That's kind of an inevitable quality and a difficult one to find. Our friends at the Democracy Fund call this, I think, ecosystem builders. It's a certain type of person. The second is the compelling value of an idea. The 2 ideas, prison recidivism and reentry in the city with the highest incarceration rate of any top 10 American city, yielding to this very compelling and well-branded idea, broke in Philly, broke meaning without money, broke meaning the system is broke, about poverty and economic justice. That's really what the news teams have rallied around. It's a great story and an important story. And the last piece is, again, this strength in the ecosystem. I came at it as a skeptic. I was an executive at the Wall Street Journal. We were our own ecosystem. And that's how we rolled. That's how Rupert Murdoch rolls. And I've become a convert to this notion that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, or that a rising tide lifts all boats. Pick your cliche, but they turn out to be true. And I think it's both a challenge and noteworthy in a place like Detroit that the Detroit Free Press is somehow not a part of the collaboration, if they're not. I think it's important.
They are.
Oh, they are. Okay, yeah. Pardon me. But it's important that all players in the marketplace collaborate and do so on an equal basis.
Yeah, great points. I'm going to pass this to Chicago, but before I do that, Jean, when you were talking about transparency and that openness, and the recommendations from the commission were radical transparency on the journalism side, but how about radical transparency on the funder side, right?
Exactly.
I know we can continue to be better on that, and that will excel these partnerships, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So,
I'm really glad Jean brought up power, because that's something I wanted to talk about with this audience. And it's mostly for funders and financiers and other gatekeepers who are in this room. But we're kind of new into the relationship. Our program hasn't been around that long to have some deep and wise words of lessons learned. But in terms of before we started the program, I mean, we really had to grapple with our institution, and our leadership had to grapple with what does it mean to do this work in Chicago and really share power, and even go further and relinquish power. So we get to do the anointing and the selection of grantees. And that's one place where we exercise an enormous amount of power. But once we identify these good groups, we should be giving them unrestricted support. We should be giving them multi-year support. We shouldn't be tinkering and telling them what to do. We should say, we believe in you, we're gonna give you this support, and we're gonna see what you do. And thank you, I've been on a general operating kick for most of my career at MacArthur, which is longer than most of you would think, and that's the first and only time I've gotten applause for that, so thank you. I can quit now. But in any case, I think this idea of letting folks who are closer to the work, so our relationship and partnership with the Field Foundation, it's a local foundation that has deep roots in the community, led by an African-American president who's built a whole race and equity lens frame around how they do grant making, putting the resources in their hands. And honestly, when we started this work and we thought about partnering with them, we had 3 to 5 things we thought that they should do with the resources. They did all these meetings, talked to a bunch of people, and they came back with 10 other things that they thought we should do. And we had to be humble enough to say, oh, yeah, you're right, you should do that. Even though it's all of our funding going to start this new program, we have to be able to say, now it's on you, and we trust you. And yes, you're closer to the ground, you're closer to the community. You have the authority, credibility to tell us what this program needs to be, and then to say, okay, let's do that. And I think that's really important. That's really hard to do. I work for a very big institution, of course, and some of you here as well, and it's hard to deliver that message up. But we give a lot of affordances, and we make a lot of accommodations for other organizations that are maybe more mainstream, maybe led by individuals who have more veteran status. We pour tons of money into them, as we should in most cases, to build their organizations and to figure out how to get their digital engagement strategies running, to figure out how to run a business. We pour a lot of money into these other places, and we give lip service to diversity and representation, and we give little bits of money for those kinds of activities and those kinds of organizations. And I think we need to be more fair about how we do that and really distribute and share out that power with our grantees.
thank you. Darryl, do you want to comment on this?
I have nothing to add.
Okay.
Both of these points were incredible. I'll leave it right there.
Kathy, I do have to say the general operating piece. I mean, that is powerful, and I think that we can learn from that. I'm going to pass this to Detroit, but I am going to reframe the question, if that's okay. So I want to tease out a little bit from the Community Foundation's perspective, the fund and the forms, and some lessons learned from that. But also, I think that that's really, we have a room full of local funders, community foundations. Those two things are replicable, right? So what advice would you have to the audience for getting started with a fund or the form side, the convening side?
Well, they go together. And I always step back and I say, why are we doing this? And so from the Community Foundation standpoint, it's really, what does the community need? What do people need? And what's the best way to make that happen? And there's no easy answer. I mean, at least I don't know what the answer is. So part of what we're trying to do is stimulate a whole lot of experiments. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I realized, and I'm not the staff person that runs this, so I can be wrong on this, but it struck me when we started bringing together those who had received grants, which were both the for-profits and the not-for-profits, the bigs and the small, the new and the older, is they didn't know each other. I don't know if they didn't like each other, but they certainly didn't know each other. And so the process of having this collaboration that had been in existence for 6 or 7 years, largely larger organizations, partner up with the smaller organizations, and then bring them together 5 or 6 times a year, and you'd sit back and you'd listen to the conversation they were having, which was so exciting because they all shared a common interest, but they were going at it different ways. So for me, it was just sort of like, whoa, once they got to know each other, this was going to work. So yeah, you can certainly bring together organizations to work together. One of the requirements for the grants from the fund is that you collaborate. And so you try to pick your best bets so that it makes sense that these are going to work over time, at least we hope they are. And so you all can do that. But the secret sauce is knitting them together. And so I think we're going to see other things develop that might not have happened unless they were in the room together. And John, I don't know if does this ring true at all?
Yeah, it sure does. Among the bigger organizations that have been at the table with the Knight Foundation for 6 years now, one of the key lessons is how much more work we have to do. Katie Locker, the Detroit program director for Knight, has been front and center in challenging us and pushing us to go beyond our traditional roles and look toward the next few years. And well before Knight's Crisis in Democracy report came out, we've been studying this. We've been working together for 8 months, looking at some of the key issues here. And I'll say one lesson is this is the last time I should be on this stage talking about the Detroit project. This project going forward needs to be far more diverse. The big operations newsrooms in Detroit need to be far more diverse. And we have to answer that right now going forward, which is why we, in working with Katie, we're planning a completely new news operation that is independent of any one of the traditional players, that is going to be authentically Detroit, because the big media players are in and out of Detroit, and it's time for that to end. And we have to have Detroit journalists that are amplified by the big properties, but it's got to be far more authentic, and that's one of the key lessons and one of the things we're working for. It also has to be more transparent and accountable to the community. Our friends at Outlier Media and Steve Henderson, who's with both Detroit Public TV and WDET and DPTV, are all working together on a public engagement model, much deeply informed by what we've learned from Philly on the front end, to better understand and report not just out to the nonprofit media, but also to the for-profit media, what Detroiters are telling us are their highest priorities. What are the key themes here that can be covered over time that we can all share and work in? And then go back to the community when the coverage has been done to say, how did we do? And where do we still have shortcomings? Where can we get better? And there's so much more work to do, I think is one of the key takeaways here.
Yeah, I have to say for Detroit, you guys do have the money, but you also have the voice, and I think that's taken extraordinary leadership on your part, Mariam and John. That voice that you've had, which is not just about the money, as John said. John, do you want to add to this conversation?
Well, I
From
just
your perspective?
Maybe make an observation, which is to bring everything back to me. One of the nicest things that has happened to me in a long time, and one of the best learning experiences was when Alberto asked me to be a part of the Knight Commission, and the through line that ran through the work of that commission was this notion of trust and the dissolution of trust in the various institutions in our society. And so I took that as an excuse to sort of focus my sort of bedtime reading on trust. And so everybody from Frank Fukuyama to the Dalai Lama, who's one of the few people around who could probably hang with Frank intellectually. And and what I kept thinking about was my fellow Commissioner Rainey Aronson at our very first meeting said, I think the problem in local news is communities have lost the sense that these news institutions have our backs. And if you, from Fukuyama to the Dalai Lama, what recurs in these notions of trust is that trust requires reciprocity, right? That's really, really core to the notion of trust. And what you've got on the stage are news institutions, collaborations that are coming together to once again have the backs of these communities and to show that there is reciprocity and that the media or journalism is not some abstract, malign, elite institution that is just as likely to do something to us as for us. And so these are the examples that we've got to find the voice to get more money to fund.
Yeah, exactly. We are quickly running out of time, so I'm going to have one more question, and we're going to open it up. This is for the media side. What I'm hearing, Darryl, Jean, and John, is really, and Mariam, of course, with your fund, that engagement is at the heart of the work, and so engagement is really paired with the journalism, and I would love to tease that out because I know that resonates a lot with our local funders. Can you tell me a little bit about? I'll start with you, Darryl. Can you tell me a little bit more about how engagement is such a core part of your work?
I will say I'm much more interested in equipping in terms of that spectrum. I think engagement is great. I think we have a little bit of work to do in terms of what does it mean to engage.
Yeah.
But I think equipping communities with the skills that we have is very concrete.
Fair.
We depend on journalists for information a lot of times, and I think we could do work to engage people in the process, but also how do we share the skills in terms of whether it's interviewing, note-taking, using your phone as a recording device. How do we impart that information? How do we share that power that we have? How do we share the access that we have so that people can work with us, or in some places, when we are not present, journalists in the community, how do they take on that role as information gatherer themselves? Yep. How do we trust people to do the work of gathering information and distributing it to their communities?
Thank you for the equipping. Yes, that's what Jean, John?
So I think, John, I love the point that you just brought up, because I think a lot of times in the journalism space, we think about engagement as a way to push our reporting out, right? To make sure it doesn't go off into the ether and make sure it connects with folks, and that's incredibly important. But I think sometimes what's lost is the engagement part before the reporting even happens, and making sure that the reporting that we're doing is not just about people, but for people and/or with people, which goes to sort of the equipping side of it. So I'll give, two quick examples from our work. When we were wrapping up the reentry project, we knew we were going to go into a second year or second iteration. We decided that we, as sort of the editors, were not just going to decide what topic should we focus on for the second year. And we thought we should actually just ask people, residents of Philadelphia, what do you think we should report on? Mm-hmm. So we kind of put that out there, collected responses in a number of ways through SMS text messaging and in-person events and online forums. Got hundreds of responses, a fascinating list of suggestions, everything from litter in the city to human trafficking to education to poverty. And then we sat together as editors and said, okay, what makes sense for us to take on as a collaboration? Where is there real value added by all of us news organizations focusing our efforts on one topic? And so that's how we came to the topic that we have now. And so we think of engagement as this sort of grounding principle. Mm-hmm. One other real quick example, we're really excited about leveraging the value of the collaborative right now to do better coverage of the municipal elections. In Philadelphia, we have a mayor race, council race, and so there's been a great conversation about how can we as a group make sure that candidates are answering the right questions on the city's economic reality. So we're going to be crowdsourcing a Broken Philly candidate questionnaire, asking people what questions do you have for candidates? What should we be asking them about the poverty problem and the issue of economic mobility? And then we'll push that out directly to candidates. Reporters will have it on hand. We may hold a candidate forum to have them answer in person. So how can we kind of leverage this, this sort of model that we're using to really make sure that our reporting is community responsive from the very beginning?
I love that. John, do you want to add anything to that?
I could simply say what Jean said, but actually what the Detroit team is trying to do is to follow in Philly's footsteps in a couple of key ways. Our friends at Outlier Media have really mastered a text messaging system that reaches citizens in ways that polling doesn't work and in ways that just knocking on doors doesn't work either, to really dig more deeply into what community needs are. Our friends at Detroit Public TV have done intense engagement with university researchers in a couple of areas of Detroit to, again, more deeply probe what citizens really care about, to get past one of the traditional trust problems in journalism, which is, if all of you who've worked in a newsroom, I'm sure you've heard the phrase ring out in the newsroom, "That's a good story." Well, says who? Says we. We're the professionals. We know. And I think what Philly is way out in front of us on, but where we hope to catch up soon, is giving the public the voice to say whether it's a good story or not, both on the front end and then after the story is published, aired, broadcast, whatever. Well, was it or not? And what more can we do next? Putting those engagement systems in place to guide and hold accountable the actual journalism.
Thank you.
Lilly, I hope we have time for one question.
Yes, so raise your hand, and then while you're raising your hand, John, can you just tell us very quickly how local funders can potentially get involved with the American Journalism Project?
Well, local funders primarily, I mean, what we want to do is when you have identified a need together with the management team in your community to start or to supplement the finances of a civic news organization, we want to go in to your community shoulder to shoulder with you, provide matching funds, hopefully provide some expertise. We'll certainly have some opinions, but we want to be an enterprise that makes you feel better, more safe, more confident about funding CNOs in your communities.
Great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kevin Davis. I'm representing Harkin, and I have my own company, KLJD Consulting. I've worked with literally hundreds of startup news organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit. They often ask me to turn towards national funders to see is there a way for them to get in the door. And frankly, with the announcement of the American Journalism Project, there's a certain amount of whiplash when we're telling people focus on local, but they still want to come back to the national funders. So my question, I think possibly to John and to Kathy, who I both know, what advice would you give these small startup independents, both for-profit and non-profit, about how should they be viewing national funders? How can they leverage the work you're doing? And is there ever a possibility for direct funding, or should they be moving more towards the gatekeeper type organizations that Kathy mentioned?
Kathy?
Well, from MacArthur's perspective, a couple of things. It's a really exciting time for journalism in that the interest from the donor community in funding journalism media is higher than it's ever been. This used to be, we would have a funders meeting of journalism funders, and there would be like 3 of us in the room 15 years ago. 10 years ago, there were maybe 30. Now when we have these meetings, we can fill up a conference room of this size. So it's a better situation than it ever was. At the same time, I understand that if you're not in a place like Chicago or New York, one of these bigger cities where these initiatives are happening, it can seem like a pretty grim situation. But that's why we've created Newsmatch with the Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund, and others. That's a place for folks to go. And we just have to keep at it. I think it isn't the case. I certainly wouldn't want to walk down the stage and have 20 or news outlets approach me for funding, because it's just not, I'm sorry, but it's just not something that we can do. But do we want to be a part of a movement to talk about supporting journalism. That's partly what the Knight announcement does. It elevates the status of journalism for democracy. It makes, it brings to the national conversation the importance of philanthropic support for journalism, something that is a relatively new concept compared to philanthropic support for the arts or other issues. So I think that there's value in these kinds of announcements. They might not all trickle down to everybody that's who needs it, but that plus Newsmatch plus a lot of other efforts that we funders are doing behind the scenes to raise philanthropic support of journalism. Believe me, we're doing it. Jennifer's doing it. I'm doing it. We are talking to folks in all over the all around the country. Right after the Trump election, I had so many foundations from all over the country call me and say, we want to do journalism funding. We've never done it before, but now we realize we need to. And so there is this momentum and conversation happening, but I do understand the frustration from smaller news outlets that it may not be coming to you yet. So I don't have an answer for that in the short term, but in the longer term, I do think there's something happening at the intersection of philanthropy and journalism that's really exciting right now.
Alberto's going to jump in.
It really is a different time. But where I would start is with the Shorenstein review of. Do you remember when it was? Lashara, do you remember? Shorenstein did a survey.
Yeah. In June.
June of last year. Of who's funding in this area, and you'd be, I kind of know, and I was amazed at what I was looking at. What I would tell you is to read it skeptically, read it without rose-colored glasses, because they do tend to meld both organizations that are funding journalism, as we've traditionally thought about it in terms of verification journalism and straight up journal, whatever phrase you want to use, and using media for a particular social purpose or program. That is also something that was included in both as one big report on who's funding in the media space. So depending on who the client is, to your direct question, depending on who the client is, I think you'll find there a lot of information. I guarantee you'll find funders you never knew were funding in the general area. Some of them may not be for you if you're running a different kind of news operation, but they may very well be for you if you're running a different kind of news and information program. So it was done by Shorenstein. Jennifer, who was the editor? I know Nico is the one who's running it, but he was here. Well, in any case, the Shorenstein Center at Harvard is where the report can be found.
And you can find that online. Thank you, Alberto. John, did you want to make a final point about that question?
Sure. When a reporter asked Ted Kennedy if he ever thought about running for president, and he said, I don't think about it anymore, and I don't think about it any less either. and I think local news organizations, when they think about national philanthropy, they're in the same boat. It's yes and, it's always. But what I would say, from the perspective of, at least from our perspective, having given out precisely no grants, we're going to be most interested in organizations that have demonstrated local support, but we're also going to be willing to go in and help generate local support. So that's a big part of what the hypothesis on which we base this.
I'm getting the it's over from Robin. Thank you so much, all of you, for your perspective on how we can ground this in communities. I know for a fact that there are many audience members who want to talk with each of you. So if I can just make a request, if you can just hang out a little bit, and because I know there's a lot of questions, and thank you for your time and for your perspective.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.